Well, I'd like to first welcome you all to this event of the Muslim Societies in South Asia series, co-sponsored by the South Asia Institute and the Alwaleed Islamic Studies program. And today we have the really honor and pleasure of welcoming Anna Bigelow, Associate Professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University, where she won the Outstanding Junior Faculty Award from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences in 2009. She received her MA from Columbia University and PhD in Religious Studies from UC Santa Barbara with a focus on South Asian Islam. Her book, Sharing the Sacred, Practicing Pluralism in Muslim North India, Oxford University Press, is a study of Muslim majority community in Indian Punjab and the shared and civic spaces in that community. And this book, I myself, having read it, think it's really it's a fantastic piece of work and brings forward a lot of issues that, especially in terms of diversity and pluralism, that we need to be looking at very seriously, and the role that religious institutions can play in promoting that. So thank you very much for that book. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So Bigelow's current research, funded by the Scholars Program of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, involves further study of contested and cooperatively patronized multi-religious sacred sites in Asia and the Middle East, focusing on the inter-religious dynamics that complicate or ameliorate these relations in plural communities around the world. She speaks and writes frequently on religious extremism, religion and conflict, and the role of Islam today. All right. So with that, I'd like to welcome you once again and, hand over.
Hand the floor.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I very much appreciate your having me here and for showing up in the middle of spring break and all that, or on the eve of spring break. Can everybody hear me okay in the back there? So what I'm going to talk about today is along some similar themes to work I've done before, but I'm shifting my focus, whereas the book that was mentioned was based in the Punjab in North India. I've recently been doing research in South India in the state of Karnataka and Bangalore and in the mountains, the coffee mountains nearby. And so one of the things that started to sort of percolate a little bit more in my mind is trying to study comparatively, cooperatively and contestedly shared sacred sites, and also about what is the relationship between these sites and secular institutions, particularly democratic societies such as India, and my other research has recently been in Turkey, democratic societies with complicated histories of interreligious relations and also major religious population shifts between the two in both situations, and looking at in both societies are also secular democracies where the relationship between religions is very carefully managed by the state to a certain degree, and becomes a very interesting focus for how people themselves understand what it means to live in both a democratic and a multi-religious and a secular society. So in South Asia, in India, where my focus in South Asia is, this has been obviously a very fraught issue. Some of you, I'm sure, are South Asianists or are familiar with South Asia, and in that regard, you are aware that in recent years, and particularly since the election of Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, he was elected in May 2014, a new sort of buzzword has entered the ongoing debates about Indian secularism. Ghar Wapsi, which you can see here, a image that is ostensibly recording one of these events, which literally means homecoming, but is often translated as forced conversion by its critics or as this sort of return or reconversion by its proponents. So Ghar Wapsi is the current term for so-called reconversion of Muslim, Christian, or Buddhist Indians who are thought of as primarily Hindu or primordially Hindu by many in the Hindu nationalist movement, which is currently in the ascendancy politically in India. Indeed, not only do many Hindu nationalists believe that Indians have been, in the words of the Karnataka state secretary of one of Hindu nationalist organization, Mahabaleshwar Hegde, they have been strayed away, these Hindus, these Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists, etc., have been strayed away from their faith of origin. And it also refers to the practice of returning them to Hinduism. And they say that this practice of returning them to Hinduism is in fact not a new one, as in this conversation about Garvapsi, but let us not restart our computer. Thank you. I did just say restart now? Oh no, okay. Cancel. All right, so not paying attention, sorry. A little hasty with my mousing here. All right, I think we're safe. So one of the arguments of the Hindu nationalists is that this idea of returning these strayed non-Hindus, now non-converted Hindus, is a very old practice. Some trace it back to 1969 in Udupi, a city in Karnataka, where a group of Hindu sants or religious leaders gathered to strategize about how to re-Hinduize the population. Others see the roots of Garvapsi back in the early 20th century Shuddhi movement of the Arya Samaj, a Hindu organization that was very focused on trying to return people to Hinduism who had left for Sikhism or Buddhism or Islam and Christianity as well. These were purification campaigns, as it were. Hegde himself, this Hindu nationalist leader in Karnataka, points to Shivaji, the 17th century Maratha warrior king, who's an especial hero of the Hindu nationalists because of his resistance to Mughal rule in the 17th century. So Garvapsi events must be seen in the context of a profound vulnerability for religious minorities in India, where churches and Christians have been attacked, mosques are desecrated, and just recently in Karnataka, a male Muslim student was beaten very badly for being photographed with his female Hindu classmates. So Prime Minister Modi has been much criticized in the media for his long reluctance to speak publicly against this increasing intolerance. He finally broke his silence on February 17th of this year, saying that my government will not allow any religious group belonging to the majority or the minority to incite hatred against others, overtly or covertly. Mine will be a government that gives equal respect to all religions. So we'll unpack a little bit of how he expresses this and what it means. The entirety of Modi's brief speech, which was actually given in the context where he was meant to be honoring the beatification of two Catholic saints. He was speaking at an event that was honoring these two Indian Catholics. He actually expressed the idea of tolerance in profoundly Hindu, or perhaps more precisely Hindu nationalist terms, quoting the Rig Veda, Swami Vivekananda, and Rabindranath Tagore, among others. He indeed said that the lives of these new Christian saints could be explained through the Sanskrit saying that he translated as, welfare of the world is the way to moksha, without acknowledging that moksha is a profoundly Hindu concept that would perhaps not be deeply meaningful to these new Catholic saints, who are also obviously dead, but the idea of the Hindu release from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, that concept certainly does not resonate with Catholic concepts of death and the afterlife or the status of sainthood itself. In this brief speech, the word secularism never passed Modi's lips. Indeed, you don't hear him use it terribly often. His speech very neatly expresses the way in which Hindu nationalists frame questions about the status of other religions in India. So after Modi interpreted these new Christian saints through the Hindu concept of moksha, he cited a Rig Veda passage that said, "Let noble thoughts come to us from all sides." And of course, he recited it in the original Vedic, to express India's openness to new ideas. However, in his phrasing, it was India that was gifting these new ideas to the rest of the world and not necessarily India's openness to other ideas in the way he phrased it. He quoted Swami Vivekananda in order to point out that we believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true, evoking a very common Hindu nationalist concept that Hindus are inclusive and tolerant, while the other alien religions are exclusivist and intolerant. So Hinduism absorbs everything, welcomes everything. The other religions are the ones that are rejecting. So most significantly, he actually said that the principle of religious freedom that is enshrined in the Indian constitution is not, in fact, the product of the modern secular conception of the status of religion, as devised by the document's main author, and who is a strong critic of Hinduism, B.R. Ambedkar, but it is part of India's ancient cultural tradition, long predating Christianity and Islam in the subcontinent. He says, this principle of equal respect and treatment for all faiths has been a part of India's ethos for thousands of years, and that is how it came to be integral to the Constitution of India. Our Constitution did not evolve in a vacuum. It has roots in the ancient cultural traditions of India. So in this way, he's expressing his belief in the equality of all religions, by which he means that the majority and minority should be treated identically, a highly debated view of equal treatment in a nation where minorities fare far worse by most indices. And so this is a key issue over which Hindu nationalist perceptions of equal treatment diverge from other Indian interpretations of secularism. So this is very much the context in which conversations about secularism are happening nowadays and have been happening for pretty much the past 20 years, since at least since 1992 and its preamble with the destruction of a mosque in Ayodhya by Hindu nationalists and the ensuing debates about the status of religion, and particularly non-indigenous originating religions like Islam and Christianity in particular. So this is one way in which secularism is conceived of. And another common usage of the term secularism is one that I actually encounter in my research. In an article on April 18th, 2011, in The Hindu, a newspaper, national newspaper, it described as secular an annual event in Bangalore, which is called the Karaga, in which a Hindu priest, incarnating an epic heroine, Draupadi, dances around the old city of Bangalore and then pauses en route to pay a visit to a Sufi tomb, which she then dances around several times. And so the way the newspaper reports this, the festival's secular nature can be gauged by the fact that just before sunrise, the Karaga procession halts before the Dargah-e-Sharif, the tomb shrine of Hazrat Tawakkul Mastan, an 18th century Muslim saint. So in what sense can we understand this moment of ritual exchange as between a goddess and a Sufi as secular? Certainly in contemporary American usages, secular means a separation of religion and the state in some way. This is obviously an encounter between religions, but is understood in many Indian conceptions as being exemplary of secularism. On the one hand, we could just dismiss this as imprecise language of the media, that simply another term for pluralism as it's conceived of in contemporary American usage. But I suggest that this usage actually matters a great deal, as secularism in this context is about the ideal relationship between the majority Hindus and minority Muslims, and as such, it is an articulation of the place of religious diversity within the Indian polity. So furthermore, we have to acknowledge that many Indians do in fact understand the secular in precisely this very embodied and practical way. People talk about secular shrines and secular festivals, and I think we should take this usage seriously. And so we will see that the complex nature of the secular is actually revealed in moments of encounter, and how these moments are interpreted through a variety of cultural discourses. In this case, the journalist for The Hindu is adding his voice to the view that the secular is exemplified by active mutual engagement between Muslims and Hindus through a shared religious experience. So Indian secularism is, of course, famously fraught and riddled with debates and tensions. The effort to understand and define the secular plays out within local networks of exchange and in personal practices, as well as in the political realm. These arenas of the secular are interconnected, but operate with distinct mechanisms, unfolding along uneven pathways defined by personal belief, collective identity, and state and official interests. In my research in India and Turkey, as elsewhere, the status of religions in relation to the state and in relation to one another is a matter of paramount concern, directly affecting the ways in which religious communities define themselves, establish their rights within the nation, and determine the frameworks through which religious groups and individuals may interact. The official structures of secularism include constitutions, courts, legislatures, and academia. And to varying extent, these macro-level discourses do shape the micro-level, providing some of the representational language through which actors claim their rights and filter their understandings of what it means to be a citizen of the secular Indian state. However, individual practices and grassroots interactions also very much determine how people on a daily basis define and experience the multi-religious realities they inhabit. And so these practices and interactions give substance to the concept of secularism. Whether deemed positive or negative, these exchanges produce spiritual languages that are at least partially autochthonous to the religious worlds many people inhabit and help to form what Indian secularism actually means practically as well as spiritually. So today I want to explore the range of the secular through examining two Sufi shrines in Karnataka. First is the tomb shrine known by many, postpone, right? Or do not remind me ever again. How does this work? How about, let's say, 4 hours from now? Here we go. All right, the first is the tomb shrine that's known by many as the Baba Buddhan Shah Durga in Chikmagalur, in the Coffee Hills of Karnataka, which is also identified as the Swami Dattatreya Pita by many others. This site nowadays could be the poster shrine, if such a thing could exist, for communal, that is, interreligious conflict. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the usage in South Asia of communal to mean religiously chauvinistic or partisan in some fashion, rather than communal as in embracing unity in some way. So this site is very much a site that's been known for it being a flashpoint for conflict. And so in Karnataka, which some journalists have dubbed this state Hindutva's laboratory, that is Hindu nationalists' laboratory. The second site is the tomb of Hazrat Tawakkalmastan mentioned here that has a reputation for communal harmony or interreligious harmony. Both places are shared sacred sites that illustrate just how complex and multivalent Indian secularism can be. So just as a sort of background for those of you who don't work in these contexts, visiting the tombs of Muslim saints is a common activity for people of all religions in South Asia and in many other parts of the world, though you wouldn't know it to hear people talk about this today. This happens in Central Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, and indeed even in the Middle East. Yet, as some reject these visitations as unorthodox, for many others, these tombs and the interactions they provide between the pilgrim and the interred saint and between pilgrims themselves are actually part of a consciously chosen pious practice through which visitors deliberately are choosing to go to places where they are inevitably going to encounter the religious other. So shared sacred sites provide convenient arenas of encounter between religions to examine how religion and the secular are intimately connected. At shared sites, the secular may be enacted as an active co-presence, a step towards the other in a controlled space. And in the event of positive engagement, then it shapes collective understanding of secularism that embraces the coexistence of multiple religious traditions as an ethical good, if not also as a political necessity or as politically pragmatic. Such views are expressed by many visitors to shared sites who imitate one another's behaviors, seek out contact or consultation from one another across religious boundaries that may be recognized or unrecognized, and see the presence of people from other religious communities as a validation of the site's efficacy and its power. For others, the secular and these modes of interreligious exchange are oppositional, that these are places where behavior, ideology, and sensibilities can actually be opposed to one another in order to undermine relations between communities. In this sense, shared spaces like this site, which is from my earlier work in Punjab, shared spaces are then unwelcome, and the presence of the other is viewed as both a misuse of the site and potentially an effort to appropriate it. Such people would then seek to capture the collective imagination and redefine the sites, not as exemplary of some positive pro-social exchange, but as instantiations of anti-religious ideology of a secular power structure that is regarded as actually playing favorites, particularly towards minority religions. Whether these sites are viewed as positive or coercive, as embracing or discriminating, the people who engage these sites know that their functioning or their dysfunctioning is indicative of the nature of interreligious relations in the communities in which they're located, and that the ability to control the cultural meaning of the site is also a way of engaging in national discussions about the nature of India's multi-religious polity. For these reasons, we tend to see abundant coverage in the Indian press of events that carry potentially significant meaning for the collective understanding of the secular. In India, then, discourses of secularism emerge in several different ways in relation to these sites that I'm working on. On the one hand, we see the secularism of equal treatment. As the hereditary custodian of the Baba Buddhan Shah shrine put it, secularism means that everyone wants the same things. There should be no interference in religion, and there should be no force to religion. Everyone has rights. So a very sort of rights-based discourse, kind of statist idea that everybody should have their rights secured. And most people would recognize this version of secularism. However, not all Indians agree that this secularism, as endorsed by the Indian state and its agents, is in practice equitable towards all. In particular, Hindu nationalists expend considerable effort to portray religious minorities as being the particular beneficiaries of the policies that are intended to secure this equity. Official secularism in India, then, refers not to the separation of religion and the state, but to the constitutional requirement that all religious communities be equal recipients of the state's support necessary to maintain and propagate their faith, their languages, and their cultural practices. And there is some structural contradictions here, and that Partha Chatterjee has pointed out in some of his work that the Indian ruling elites are both involved in supporting and regulating religious institutions, even as they in the Constitution declare the separation of religion and politics as a fundamental principle. This ambivalent simultaneity of separation and regulation is evidenced by the fact that India's Constitution, and these are some of the provisions on religion, enshrines many more rights for religious minorities than does, say, the United States Constitution, prohibiting religious discrimination, guaranteeing freedom of practice and propagation, management of institutions, preservation of language and culture, and the establishment of educational institutions, which all must be given equal state aid. And in fact, this is one of the arenas where this Ghar Wapsi movement has been particularly interesting, because many people have said that what should happen is nobody should be allowed to convert. Essentially, there should be some kind of a moratorium on conversions of any kind. But in fact, there is the ability to propagate one's religion is in fact enshrined in the Constitution. And so then what does propagation actually mean? Will perhaps that will actually come to debate, and perhaps not. Remains to be seen. So, given the unequal social, economic, and political position of minorities in India, this has resulted in certain exceptional policies, such as the status of Muslim personal law, in which Muslims in matters of marriage, divorce, and inheritance have a legal code of that's separate unto that community, whereas the majority religions and several other, including Sikhs and others, are all under a uniform civil code. This has been a particular bee in the bonnet of many Hindu nationalists. And so this idea of exceptional treatment has then therefore also undermined the role of the state in trying to enforce religious pluralism and its idea of secularism, because the state is seen, as Chatterjee puts it, as hopelessly compromised by its legal protection of the differential and allegedly backward practices of the minority communities. So, state reports have also pointed out that although Indian Muslims are seen as being appeased and coddled and given all of this special treatment, that certainly has not resulted in a higher status in anything else. So they have larger rates of illiteracy, lower life expectancy, greater rates of incarceration, lower representation in all matters of official and state and governmental employment, etc. So state secularism may be seen as appeasing minorities, but this institutionalized secularism operates in conversation with the ways in which many Indians actually negotiate the nexus of state power, media representation, and personal experience to define secular subjectivities that don't neatly adhere to this state power model defined by the Constitution, the courts, or electoral politics. So to dig into some of our examples to see how these concepts are actually worked out on the ground, we can see very deep ambivalence about and many different definitions of the secular at, for example, this shrine, the Durga Baba Buddhan Shah or the Swami Dattatreya Pita in Karnataka. The site's been actively contested for about 20 years, though the roots of the stress go back further. It's a site that is holy, that many Hindus believe is the site where a avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu, Swami Dattatreya, sort of more complicated than just Vishnu, but for our purposes, that Swami Dattatreya spent some time here and meditated here. But many Muslims and other Hindus believe that it's the place where one Muslim saint meditated for a time, and then his disciples subsequently were buried there. So for hundreds of years, there was no serious conflict here between Muslims and Hindus. Indeed, Hindu rulers and Hindu devotees have patronized this Muslim-managed site for generations. But since the late 1990s, conflicts have emerged incrementally and from a number of directions, leading to a very divisive, confusing, and tenuous situation. The strife relates to several factors. Not only the rise in the 2000s of Hindu nationalist politics in Karnataka, but also to local skepticism about the shrine's management and familial tensions among the managers. So everything here has two identities. In this picture, you can see there's this I took in my first visit to the site in 2001, and sort of very far away at the bottom of the stairs here behind the gentleman who's walking up, there is a cave shrine. So I think in one of these pictures down here, I might have a better picture. So this on the right is one of the attendants at the shrine, or the main attendant at the shrine, standing in front of what used to be the entrance to a cave shrine that was at the bottom of the stairs that we saw. So this was in 2001. So in that cave, there's a meditation seat of a Sufi called Dada Hayat, or the meditation seat of Dattatreya. Inside the inner cave, there's a tunnel, which is sort of an invisible tunnel that can either take you directly to Benares or to Medina, depending on your point of view. There's a pair of silver-coated sandals that are either paduke in the Hindu terminology or a khadav in the Muslim terminology. Outside the chamber are either 4 tombs of the disciples of the Sufis or 4 samadhis, or places of burial of people in a deep yogic state of Dattatreya's disciples. And the list goes on of things that are multiply identified. Until 1964, in Karnataka, all religious sites were managed by the Muzrai department, a kind of a state body that oversaw religious sites. But in 1964, the Waqf board, which oversees Muslim sites, was formed, and Muslim religious endowments came under its jurisdiction. The Waqf management for this region was undesirable to the Muslim custodian of the shrine, and he tried to get the site put under the Muzrai because he didn't want to share its management with, I guess, the more invasive Waqf. It's hard to tell what actually was happening in '64 while he started this. The case went on until 1991, when it was finally, the site was placed under the Muzrai department on the basis of the state actually adjudicating what constituted what kind of religious practice. So were these Hindu practices or Muslim practices? And so the court actually determined, on the basis of the fact that people broke coconuts and lighted lamps and did other kinds of things that they determined were exclusively Hindu, which is entirely problematic, that the site could in fact be adjudicated by the Muzrai. This also, though the Sajida Nashin, the custodian of the site, was happy about that, this actually also opened the door to people who wanted, in fact, to remove the custodianship of the site from the Muslim family altogether. So, in the 1991 decision, another thing that the court decided was that all practices that happened before 1975 would be frozen in time, so there could be no new practices. This came under attack as Hindu nationalist groups like the Vishva Hindu Parishad and the Bajrang Dal laid claim to the shrine and attempted to wrest its management from the Shah Qadri. One of the main strategies they used in order to do this was to try to institute a birthday celebration for Dattatreya that happens at the end of December every year, so it's just gone by a few months ago. So first, these groups sought to integrate Hindu rituals and pilgrimage cycles into the life of the shrine. There's a massive regional pilgrimage cycle related to Swami Ayyappa in Kerala that's just an enormously well-populated pilgrimage in India. And so some pilgrimage circuits will bring pilgrims through this site, which is actually quite remote from it in many ways. So that's one way in which these groups tried to sort of reconfigure the shape of the site and its constituency. Historical arguments were also made and evidence published and preached to support the claim that there was a historical temple here and that these Muslim tombs were simply, pieces of stone on the ground. There were no actual bodies buried there. Third, there were court cases filed, and some of them met with success. But the court's decisions were often very ambivalent. The courts in India have generally been very reluctant to get too involved in some of this stuff, having met with a lot, and so often exacerbating tensions around the cases that they're adjudicating. And finally, some national leaders increasingly turned their attention to the shrine, beginning to put this site on the map as the so-called next Ayodhya. So this is one of the favorite kinds of sayings of the Hindu nationalists. This will be the next Ayodhya. Politically, this region in Chikmagalur, where the site is located, is an interesting one. It's been one of the more politically divisive districts in all of Karnataka. So the BJP, the Hindu nationalist political party that's currently in power in the central government with a vast majority, they held a large majority with a small coalition in Karnataka from 2002 to 2013. But in 2013, they went from 110 seats. They lost 70 seats in the Legislative Assembly. So it completely reversed the national trend as the BJP completely lost power in Karnataka. But in this town, the member of Legislative Assembly, C.T. Ravi, remained in power, and this site, and converting the site to a Hindu site, has been one of his key platforms. So this strategy of turning this into a Hindu site has been accompanied by demonstrations, which have occasionally turned violent over the years, where Hindu nationalists have said, we are going to have this Jayanti, we're going to go into the cave itself, we're going to cleanse it of the kind of pollution that they believe has occurred because of the Muslim devotion, and particularly because of the fakir, this guy, who is the main custodian. Because he eats meat, he is seen as polluting the site on a regular basis, and so therefore they want to have a pujari, a Hindu priest, appointed there full time, and they want him to not be allowed to enter into the sanctum sanctorum, as it will. The national level officials, Praveen Togadia, those of you who follow Hindu nationalist politics will know this guy's name. He almost always shows up at some point because he says the most vitriolic things that you could ever hope to quote. This is a fairly tame statement in which he says he's going to turn 30,000 destroyed temples back that are now mosques or other shrines back into Hindu temples. And this is going to be one of the places where he starts. So there have been rallies on the side of the Hindu nationalists. There have also been peace rallies and peace activists, including Swami Agnivesh, who's a sort of national level secularist activist who tries to push back against Hindu nationalism in various ways. He tries to engage them in their own terminology, trying to argue for different interpretations of the sacred texts, and to try to undermine the sort of theological legitimacy of Hindu nationalism, if you will. So he's played a role in this. And then there's also recently emerged a kind of a group that was born in 2002 after some particularly violent demonstrations around the site, the Komu Suharde Vedike, a group that is designed to bring together the Koms, the communities. The Communal Harmony Forum is how this would be translated. And so this group has its whole other, who are mostly made up of activists who self-style themselves as secularists, say that for them the 2002 violence was a watershed. We realized we had to take secularism onto the street, which is a fascinating idea, like secularism on the streets, compelling the government and mobilizing the media to fight the Gujarat shadow, referring to riots that had occurred earlier in 2002 in the state where Narendra Modi, the now prime minister, was then the chief minister, sort of like a governor, where about 250,000 Muslims had been displaced from their homes, and around 1,000 or so had been killed. Vastly more Muslims were displaced or hurt during these riots that took place, and many people have implicated Modi in facilitating that violence. This is also a very debated and complicated history that you could give a whole nother topic about. But so the Gujarat shadow from the perspective of the secularists is this idea of a creeping Hindu nationalism which is taking over India. And so he talks about a kind of aggressive secularism has to be born, in which this aggressive secularism would in fact confront not only the Hindu nationalists, but also the passive secularists, the people who actually want to live in a plural society without constant interreligious strife, and to get them to get up and take action themselves. So these people are also part of the conversation about what secularism will mean here. Here, then, we can see that by 2009, in my second visit, the site had changed a lot, and the politics clearly had their effect. Whereas before, in 2001, on the right, you can see that you could walk straight down to the shrine. Now you can no longer attend, except for actually during the Jayanti, the Hindu celebration is the only day that anybody can go down into the cave itself, which is actually in violation of the 1991 court decision that said there should be no new practices. The fakir who used to facilitate people's worship from the cave itself now has to do so from the top of the stairs and by a locked turnstile, where he places coconuts inside the turnstile. People and recite the Fatiha or various dua prayers, and then he returns their offerings, and they break coconuts up here at the top. So the whole thing has completely changed in its stylistics, and the state has itself decided what the site should be called, as you can no longer find directions to any of the Islamic names that the site has been given over the years, but it is only now, according to the official municipality, it is now the Datta Pita. So the state has this was in 2009, but since the regional government is still dominated by the BJP, I'd be surprised if that's changed. So here we see these kinds of conversations about what, in fact, secularism is coming to mean. I think I'm going to skip this one and focus on this perspective, because it's a very complicated and interesting expression of why the discourse around secularism and is not in conversation with the discourse of Hindu nationalism in any kind of productive way. So I met in Bangalore with a police anti-corruption officer who'd worked in many conflicted sites over the years. And he talked about how secularism, and particularly secularist activists, such as the guy who talked about aggressive secularism being taken to the streets, it just isn't speaking to what people actually need as a counterpoint to religious nationalism of any kind, Hindu or otherwise, or Muslim or what have you. So he says here that the secular nationalist fabric is impoverished. They just posture and mouth inanities. Secularism is just a slogan. It must make sense and give a better way for people to process information about conversion or terrorism. Secularism does not help people process. Secularism should help make sense of the other religion, the other culture, one's competitors. So secularists are promoting the liberal and modern view, but not so that I can enjoy and learn from another from within my own tradition. So I cannot be Hindu, as this guy was, and actually appreciate something about my Muslim neighbor. I have to be a secularist in order to do that. I have to displace myself from my religion in order to engage the other. So these traditions actually provide accommodation to the other. So where he sees real secularism or real interreligious exchange is not in this sort of secularist discourses or the communalist religious chauvinist discourses, but where Muslim neighbors share biryani, a sort of rice dish, on one of their festivals. These interactions celebrate cultural exchange. And so his very critical view of the ways, the sort of postures in which secularist activists deploy the terminology of secularism is in fact deep meaningless to how people are actually living. To be relevant, secularism must help people make sense of the often overwhelming circumstances in which they find themselves. religious nationalists have the advantage of clearly identifying the causes of and the solutions for the cultural threats that they perceive, like conversion and terrorism. But the people who style themselves as secular activists are often completely divorced from the systems of thought that actually are making meaning in people's lives, particularly those who reject secularism as desirable altogether. And so here we see, from a Hindu nationalist leader in Chikmagalur, a sense that secularism actually is not equal towards all religions, but is in fact against Hinduism. They only understand secularist activisms in the terms of people who are rejecting them. They never step forward to help when a Hindu is attacked. These groups like the Kamu Suharda Vedike doesn't come forward. But if a Hindu attacks a Muslim, or if a Muslim's in trouble, then they show up. So this kind of this perspective, they would argue, is actually leading people to see that secularism is in fact hostile not just to religion, but specifically to Hinduism. Secularism is a code for undermining Hinduism and giving Muslims and other minorities preferential treatment, which is exactly also their interpretation of the way the Constitution of India has been interpreted in relation to religious minorities. So very quickly, rather than just talk only about this kind of very contested and antagonistic moment where secularism is all about grappling with how do we engage the state and preserve our rights, or preserve the integrity of our religious communities, the sites that I actually spend much more time at are places like this. This is in the center of the old city of Bangalore, where secularism is discussed and interpreted as a kind of interaction and inclusion. And this was the site which was mentioned in the first quotation about secularism, the idea that this site has a secular flavor because of the interactions between the Sufi shrine and a Hindu temple down the road. So there's a Hindu temple, which is about 2 kilometers away from the Sufi tomb. This is the Dharma Raya temple in Bangalore. It's dedicated to Draupadi. Once a year, a priest from this temple spends about 6 months in preparation to incarnate the goddess Draupadi and dance around the old city of Bangalore and visits the Sufi tomb along the way. This is some of the publicity about the upcoming Karnataka event, which you can see posters and billboards around the whole neighborhood is saturated with publicity about the oncoming event. The event itself involves the priest traveling somewhat behind successive troops of Veer Kumars, or young heroes, many of whom are not so young at all, who approach, in the case where they come to the Sufi tomb, and here's their encounter with the Sufi tomb. They make small fires out of paraffin and then strike themselves in the chest with very dull, thankfully, swords that and express their willingness to kill the priest should he drop this great pot. As you can see, he has a large headdress that's covered with jasmine flowers. Underneath that is a pot full of sacred objects that nobody will tell me what is involved in that, but it's not too surprising. But it's very heavy, and she dances for about 9 hours, beginning at midnight until about 9 in the morning around the old city of Bangalore. And about 5 a.m. on the time that I witnessed this, she comes to the shrine of Hazrat Tawakkul Mustan after the Veer Kumars, who will kill her if she drops this or kill anybody who threatens her. They are displaying here their willingness to sacrifice themselves, striking themselves in the chest. So this is going on for hours, and hundreds of people coming through and doing this before. Eventually, here at about 5 a.m. comes the Karga. She dances 3 times around the tomb and exchanges lemons with the Sufi tomb custodians. And this, of course, again, is one of the ways in which the popular media and many of the constituents of these places interpret secularism here. Secularism here is about engagement. It's about interaction. It's about a sort of positive and, again, a very pro-social kind of exchange. which is not just at this festival moment at this shrine, but rather deeply ingrained in the daily life of this shrine. And so here at the tomb, and in this image, the tomb is on the right, and behind where these people are standing to the left is a mosque. And people will come typically in the afternoon and evening prayers for namaz, when after the Muslim prayer, or salat in Arabic. Mostly Hindus, some Christians, some Muslims as well, will bring their children, and after having performed their prayers, the men who are exiting the mosque will blow their breath on the children, who are in this case usually suffering from childhood disorders like bedwetting or sleep disorders or diarrhea, things like that. And it's this sort of very day-to-day kind of interaction that also reinforces the idea of what it means to be a secular site. This annual exchange, of course, between the Sufi saint and the Hindu goddess is understood by its constituents in different ways, but in general it's viewed as a sort of mutual acknowledgement of a shared spiritual territory and one another's spiritual eminence. The local press presents the event as an idealized expression of India's secular ethos. And here we see evidence of sort of a social promotion of a particular interpretation of this encounter, confirming what David Morgan argues, that all societies invest a great deal in teaching their members to feel similarly, that we see this sort of in blogs and newspaper reports, as well as in the way the custodians here express this event. In contrast, we see the disputes over the identity of the Baba Buddhan Shah, Swami Dattatreya Pita, are emblematic of secularism's failures and contestations. For Hindu nationalists, the contestation is the result of Muslim failure to assimilate into Indian society, in spite of the secular state's unjust appeasement policies and preferential treatment. For Muslims, the secular state has failed to preserve their rights, as the custodians have been battling in court since the 70s to have full rights over the place. In Bangalore, on the other hand, secular success is defined by interaction, mutual recognition, and interreligious devotion, absent of the state. In both cases, these zones of encounter, from the courts to the streets to the shrines, are constitutive of local understandings of the secular, and where people invest their energy is very telling about the shape of secularism in those communities. So these are places where individuals and collectivities seek to shape the meaning of the secular as a positive or a negative, engaging or separating, inclusive or exclusive, for themselves and to define it for others. So in some places, you get a dominant discourse and a repertoire of practices are achieved. In other places, the process is inchoate and cacophonous, with little resonance between discourse, practice, and a multi-religious population. And so it's a very complicated but very fascinating way to see these multivalent usages and engagements with the secular, both in terms of personal practice and state-level discourses and everything in between, where this is all still very much in flux. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. So we'll open up for some conversations, discussion. I want to start by just asking about, while you've talked about spaces, physical spaces, one of the other ways in which religious spaces are depicted is through Bollywood and popular sort of media culture.
Sure, yeah.
The soaps and so on, and you find Sufi shrines appearing in many of these places. And so I was just wondering, do we find, what kinds of frameworks are those places being put? Is there a consistency in there, or I don't know whether you actually.
I'm not sure. I'm not a student of Bollywood, but I would certainly agree that anecdotally, there's hard to find a major blockbuster that doesn't at some point have people dancing around a durga, and certainly they'll have a qawwali scene where there's this music is so popular, and there are people who've worked on how that musical genre very much has become a kind of safe way for a mainstream culture to engage with Indian Islam. So it's a sort of a safe way to embrace Islam without actually having to get too close to it. And so that the popularity of that musical genre may, on the one hand, may seem very representative of a shared religious culture or shared cultural environment, and a tradition that obviously draws on multiple musical inheritances. So the question, it's interesting if you consider the other kinds of debates that happen about Bollywood and religion, often where Hindu nationalists engage is not so much about whether there's a dargah scene, but whether or not it's appropriate for a Muslim actor to portray a Hindu character, or to, and you see this on both sides. Muslim critics will also say, can you have a mixed religion couple as the romantic protagonists of a Bollywood film? So this becomes a big source of debate in those conversations. So it's less about whether there's a dargah scene as in, is there something more fundamental about the identity of the actors? Or, and actually a lot of some of the Garvapsi conversation has been about people like Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan, these very high profile Muslims actors who are, from the perspective of the Garvapsi crowd, not actually Muslim and need to be brought back to the faith because as native Indians, they're primordially Hindu. They just aren't recognizing it yet. But actually, I mean, Bollywood is a major way in which the culture is trying to promote a particular idea of interreligious relations, and through scenes like that and how embedded in Bollywood Muslim culture and Muslim filmmakers and actors and producers. I mean, it's been a very multi-religious, as well as Parsi. There's been a lot of interreligious relations in Bollywood. So, but there've also been some very sectarian and provocative Bollywood movies as well.
I think that I've heard some people use the term pluralism.
Sure, yeah.
They talk about pluralism in Bollywood. But
yeah.
Have you heard people use the secularism in the context of what happened in Bollywood?
I don't read enough of the literature on this to be able to say specifically, but it'd be interesting, actually. It's an interesting question. I'm going to look that up. Yeah?
I have a question. So it was really interesting to read that quote by the police officer.
Yeah.
So I think it was a pretty nuanced perspective on what he thought secularism was and what was wrong with how secularism was perceived.
Yeah.
And the way that he was defining secularism is kind of the way that one might articulate interfaith cooperation or like an active engagement with diversity in an American context.
Right.
That it is through relationships, that it is through understanding the other story and building bridges through that. So could you give us a little bit, if you have a background story about that person, about that police officer, like what led him to develop that understanding?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned briefly that in earlier work that he'd done, he had been posted in, I can't remember off the top of my head the town. He's posted in a town where he had to manage a lot of interreligious strife between communities. And so he had some background in this, but he came from an untouchable background. And so he was very interested he also felt completely unhelped by the sort of Hindu nationalist discourses, which, though one of the conversations that's happening in relation to the Garvapsi discourse nowadays is, again, about trying to get rid of anti-untouchable prejudice, because this is why people are converting away from Hinduism, is because they are untouchable and they're left out of mainstream Hindu society, or at least so that argument goes. And so he also, he certainly didn't resonate with religious nationalism of any kind, but he, in a sense, sort of had this interesting view of just seeing how everybody is sort of missing the point. It's like as I suppose if you think of it in the terms of like double consciousness, that he could actually perceive both the operations of power as somebody who, to a certain extent, was Hindu and could understand, the privileges that society gives you as a member of a majority, but he also understands how completely left out of that he's also obviously been. And so his view of this version of secularism, where he's talking about the kind of secular nationalists who view so he's talking about secular nationalism as this idea that it's a religious ideology almost in itself, right? And it's an anti-religious ideology rather than promoting interreligious interaction. This is actually promoting the elimination of religion from public life, because that's where India falls into trouble, is when people want to bring their religion into interaction, where he sees a much more organic way of living is sort of perhaps a rose-tinted view of the past, where people could exchange biryani on Eid, and everybody plays holy, and aren't we all friends? So a very sort of idealized kind of. You see this also with people talking about bhakti and Sufi, a sort of idealization that everybody, can't we all just be friends because they all were, and they all love the same God and so forth. But as I began, the way that that's framed and the way Modi framed that in his statement about religious tolerance, it's really only tolerance within a certain framework of understanding that everything is ultimately primordially Hindu. So it's complicated.
I just have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Is that okay? And I think, so I actually worked through the State Department in a couple of Indian cities, and that's exactly what I heard on the ground, which was that secularism is the response to any kind of religious violence, but the way that people would define secularism is anti-religion, so just taking religion out of the public sphere. So that was interesting to see. The last part, which was how he saw eating with his Muslim neighbors as a way of building his form of secularism. Ashutosh Varshney writes about that as like the everyday form of civic engagement. But did he think that...
Actually, he talks about associational engagement.
He talks about associational
more
and
so
everyday.
than everyday,
But this would be considered an everyday form of civic engagement. But did this police officer think that this would build stable relations and would avert any kind of communal violence in the long term?
No. He and actually, and I would agree with this, is the view rather than these kinds of exchanges do not counter, they don't cause people to stop hating one another on the ground, but rather where such things are occurring, it's actually a way of measuring the level of interreligious engagement in a particular locale. So it's more indexical than it is causative or of any kind of new engagements. You can certainly try to promote activities that would allow additional interactions of that sort, and you see communities that have very active peace committees where local leaders meet with one another, not just when in times of stress, but try to do so regularly in order to be able to see things before they become explosive problems in the community. You see people having sort of what they like an ekta sammelan kind of things where people are meant to come together and share something such as it might be poetry, it might be food. Food is always is good in many ways, but of course this also may not be great if depending on the communities you're actually trying to reach, because some of the more chauvinistic individuals in all religions aren't going to eat each other's food necessarily. And I mean, in my first research in Malarkotla, that was one of the things that I always found interesting, is that a lot of people who really wanted to demonstrate what they called their secularism meant that they always made provision at any, at a wedding or at a funeral gathering or at any kind of public engagement to have, in that town you needed to have vegetarian food, you needed to have halal food, and you needed to have khatka, so that because there are all these Sikhs who don't eat the same kind of meat that's been killed in the same way that Muslims do. So you had to have provisions for everybody. You had to have the possibility that women could have a space to themselves if they wanted it, or could mix with others if they didn't. So there were all these ways in which this was very deliberately configured by people who wanted to publicly manifest their openness in that way. I don't think, but again, rather than being causative of peace, I think it's more indexical of the level of investment that a community is making in that kind of a society. And I think it can also it can be preventative if such institutions exist. Where I disagree with Varshney and his assessment is that he places much more emphasis on the structural power of civil societal organizations and much less emphasis on the everyday And I don't know that it's, and the question is then what's the relationship between the civil societal organizations and how much cultural cachet they have, how much do people actually value them and invest in them if there are no real civil, sort of local and everyday interactions. Do people, and again, in my earlier research, I found that the people who were the most trusted leaders in civil societal organizations were also people who were investing in many other ways and who had close friends in other communities, who didn't live in a segregated or neighborhood, and who didn't just invest their charitable energies towards their own communities, but towards multiple religious groups and things like that. So it was it had to be much more penetrating throughout their activities for them to be seen as the kind of person you'd want to be in the Chamber of Commerce with, or the Rotary Club, or any of those kinds of groups that Varshini is interested in. But yeah, this guy's brilliant. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I came in a bit late and I missed the first few minutes of the.
It's just Modi bashing.
Okay, didn't miss anything then. Thomas Blom Hansen said a long time ago, about a decade ago now, I think, that the level of debate about secularism in India had largely been carried out at a very abstract level, right?
Yeah.
That in fact nobody had actually done any kind of ethnographies of secularism in practice, and so I see your work as an engagement to try and precisely do that kind of thing. But the question that I had then was, like, to what extent has secularism as a kind of linguistic term or a category that's deployed in public discourse actually has kind of filtered down to the local level, to these shrines, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, one of the things that you did was that all of these acts get read as either communalistic or as forms of secularism, such as the last
variously
one, right?
defined, yeah.
Variously defined. And clearly one aspect of what you, I think, were trying to suggest was that this term is being kind of populated with multiple kinds of meanings, right? But what I was interested in was the idea of, like, is the term secularism the right term to describe the kinds of interactions that occurred in the Dargah between the Hindus and the Muslims, or what are the terms that they themselves would use to mobilize that interaction? Or is it just becoming the master term that is now beginning to, as it were, subsume their own terms of how they understand that engagement? So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, and so I struggle with this in some ways, because on the one hand, so I've sort of staked my claim that in fact we do have to take seriously the way people are using the term, even if what they mean by the term might be more equivalent to a different concept in terms that we, like, pluralism might more closely resemble what a lot of people mean when they say secularism, but they're still using the term secularism, and they're still conscious of these other discourses about what secularism means within the broader world. So yes, people do use this word. They use other words too, about brotherhood and about harmony and exchange and things like that. So of course there's many different words that express different features of exchange and different levels and modalities of that exchange. But they do talk about shrines as being very secular, and this place as being secular, or this person is very secular, and that's just conversationally, not with me saying, what do you think secularism means, but rather, people saying, oh, I'm the most secular person in this town, and I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I run a factory, and I have a Sikh guy who runs this part, and there's a Muslim guy who does this, and a Hindu guy who does that, and so for him, which you might say would just be multiculturalism or pluralism, that's what it means to be secular. That's what it means to support his conception of what secularism actually should mean. So people do use the term in very specific ways, and what I find interesting is trying to sort of tease out what those multiple resonances are, and to what degree then is there a thread that connects that form of secularism as plural, multicultural, interreligious exchange to secularism as equality before the law, or as having equal space within the Indian polity, having the right to claim particular redress in the event of any kind of infringement on people's rights on a religious basis in terms of property or et cetera. And so, I to me, it seems like a very intricately woven web in which people do make those connections and traces, and it is resonating with these broader conversations. So, but I think that, but it's not the only term. There are other ways in which these kinds of interactions are conceived as well. So,
again, if you're talking to English speakers,
mm-hmm.
Then of course, they use the term secular.
Mm-hmm.
But when you speak to people who are not speaking in English, or how do you understand what you're doing,
mm-hmm.
You get a very different formulation. So,
yeah.
for instance, I know in the shrine, the Ajmer shrine, Hindu women who go there sometimes express that what they're doing there is darshan.
Mm-hmm.
And that they hear it,
oh, yeah.
they're having darshan, and they come like as if it's and that's a term that's used, for going to the temple and the services there. So they're just taking that same framework of worship
mm-hmm.
and saying, okay, and God is everywhere anyway,
mm-hmm.
so it doesn't really
mm-hmm.
matter. And so we're here for
yeah.
darshan.
Yeah.
And you could have Muslim women coming there and seeing it in a totally different framework, but they're not using. They're using their own, if you will, their religious or
mm-hmm.
devotional framework,
mm-hmm.
and they're not using any of these, English or Western terms
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
at all. So I think that's another, and how one would describe that,
mm-hmm.
The same space being interpreted using different frameworks.
So, in the first site that we looked at, where it's much more contested, you do see parallel vocabularies and parallel practices that are quite distinct and and are mediated by different religious specialists that are that build out of totally separate literatures and practices. And if I were doing a different type of study, I would say that kind of site where you have these potentials are more open to people, creating discord within them because of that inherent separation. In other sites, you actually see, not everybody certainly, but there are certainly individuals who have an extremely sort of fluid vocabulary about the site. So in one case, there's a guy who's a Hindu who leads a small group of people who are devotees of a particular Muslim saint. And he talks about both that he does a kind of mala, and it's as well as zikr. He sort of switches between terms this way. He talks about his being a murshid as well as and a murid, as well as being a guru, and having chelas and things like that. So he's very self-consciously thwarts the kind of the sort of. So if I would ask him a question about his japa, his sort of regular prayer practice, he would reply, with this. He didn't get a mantra. He got he has a zikr from his teacher, and so it's as if there were. So in some cases, and again not all, there certainly is that kind of fluidity in a sense of. Rejecting unitary vocabulary even. So he wasn't saying that it's only appropriate to use the Islamic terminology in this place, but rather that this is all part of a shared conception of what it means, how one should appropriately interact with this particular saint. Other people, of course, you'd see Hindus who would refer to the saint as God. It's like wo hamare Bhagwan. That's our God. And whereas Muslims would never say that, or rarely, probably. Never say never. But that would certainly, for the most part, be seen as obviously, as going over the edge of what would be acceptable. That would be shirk. That would be idolatry. So again. This kind of availability of these different vocabularies about the places and the nature of the narratives about the saints and how widely available they are. So in the case of the second case, for example, there's one story about why this whole tradition started with the Hindu goddess stopping to to dance around this Sufi tomb, which is in itself a fascinating case to observe. And this, what's interesting about the way that story is constructed is that from, you could say, the Muslim side and the Hindu side, the reasons why the goddess stopped puts one or the other at a sort of a slightly more preferential, but not really. In both cases, there was whether the saint tripped and fell when he was trying to run after the goddess, or whether she couldn't move anymore until he came out. It wasn't a real, it's not one of these, Sufi versus yogi kind of real competitions in which people have to come out on top or the bottom. But it was more like we had to find a way to meet each other and almost as equals in a sense. So the two narratives about why this started are slightly differently constructed, but they're still kind of mutually available in a way that I find kind of intriguing about that narrative. And in going around that night, this is the site that's the most crowded. So it's like if you're following the goddess for 9 hours, you'll see other places, around some of the water tanks where people gather, and a couple temples where there's more people. But this is the site where it's packed to the point where you can't breathe. So, and it's not a huge courtyard. So it's an interest. So there's clearly, this is contains something particularly, intense about the devotional quality, and perhaps therefore the barakat, or the power that you can gain from it, the blessings. But yeah, the language question is interesting, and it's something that I talk about a little bit in my other work, but I haven't. It'll be interesting. I'm actually about to start a different kind of project at the Tawakkul Mastan Shrine, where I'm interested in looking at the marketplace outside and how the objects are circulating from the market into the shrine and then into people's homes and businesses and cars and wherever, and looking at different religious communities and how through the circulation of objects you could actually see that the circulation of both power and understanding of what goes on in these places.
My question is that whether these two terms that you use, Muslim and Sufism, are they overlapping here in your
yes.
research?
Yes.
Yeah. So they are just one.
Well, not all Muslims are Sufis, and some Sufis might resist the term Muslim in the sense that labels are not helpful in understanding our relationship to the divine, but most Sufis would identify happily as Muslim. I would say the 99% of them would probably be quite comfortable with that, except for maybe the California conversions. So that might be sort of a New Age Sufism, may have a slightly different take on it. But yeah, no, it's certainly true that not every Muslim accepts Sufism as a legitimate path within Islam. And there's a lot of contentions about that, including in South Asia, where many of these shrines in particular are sources of great debate within Indian Muslim society and in Pakistan. And this is true pretty much anywhere where these kinds of shrines exist, because the critics, of course, would say that the tomb is going to the tomb and praying in the presence of the saint is a temptation to pray to the saint and ask the saint to fulfill one's prayers, as opposed to asking the saint to bring your prayer to God, who is the only one who actually fulfills any prayers, but most of the denizens of these shrines are very aware of that and are very careful, the Muslims who are very careful to position themselves in that way. They're very conscious of this criticism and are very active in their polemics and defenses against that, and saying that those people who are opposed to us simply don't understand the nature of our practice. They think we're worshiping the saint, but we worship God just as they worship God. But we believe that this saint has been pious and exemplary and is a friend of God, a waliullah, and therefore, because this person has done all these things, our prayers can come closer to God more rapidly. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting debate. And there's some good work on those conversations. If you're interested, I can give you some readings.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just picking up on your
You have to get the
point
mic.
about
You have to get the
narrative.
mic back. I said.
Just to pick up on your point about the narrative of the Hindu goddess and the Muslim saint, right? So the kind of interpretation that's being given now is one of kind of mutuality and a kind of possibility of accommodation. But clearly another interpretation could also be given of hierarchical subordination of one to the other from both sides. So in a sense that the narrative can always, the interpretation of the narrative can change,
Sure.
which means that in a sense the question then would be like, clearly the kind of narrative has an ambiguity and flexibility to be mobilized in different ways. But that would only suggest really that at this point the social and political relations in that context are one that enable this kind of interpretation to be made. So the question is, what are the actual social and political conditions in which these shrines operate that can transform those meanings into oppositional meanings, right? So that rather than saying, and as a lot of people tend to do, practices of syncretism, if it's called that, some kind of like happy, as you said, harmonious kind of exchange. These really are kind of more kind of antagonistic or agnostic relations between different kinds of religious groups, and that in fact that there's a both possibility of accommodation, but there's also possibilities of struggle between them.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, and that was exactly what I was working with, in part in this project, but really in the first book. One of what I was very interested in was exactly how much cultural work is going into enforcing these particular interpretations and making it very difficult for alternative, whether oppositional or cooperative or whatever, whatever the non-dominant interpretation of a particular, what the meaning of the shrine was, or what the main story of the saint, or et cetera, what are the processes by which those alternative discourses are managed by the dominant view? Like, so how are people in fact disciplined if they stray outside of this? How are they silenced? How are non-dominant views of a space actually suppressed and actively suppressed by the cultural agents of a particular community? And how are they then presented over time? Can we see change over time? So in the narrative of Malerkotla, in Punjab, where I was working, that they now have this reputation of being, this shiny, happy town where everybody loves each other, but it has a very dense and complicated history where you could easily construct a story of this town as having been divided and hated each other, and lots of Hindu-Muslim opposition and Sunni-Shi'i troubles, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is another possible narrative. So why isn't that story the story that gets told about this town? And so, again, I mean, just to sort of reference back to Morgan's idea about how societies actually invest energy in maintaining particular views, there's a lot of changes that have happened in Malerkotla since partition, of course, but also in the contemporary period, that have made it far more advantageous for the community to be the emblematic Muslim town of Punjab. Has brought them all kinds of benefits. So there would be very politically pragmatic views of this. There are also, of course, the very spiritually pragmatic views of people who say, you go where it works. If this is the site where your prayers are answered, that's where you go, and you have to learn the correct language of ritual and the correct language of supplication, et cetera, and to be active there. So you can see where all of these realms sort of come into resonance with one another to have this very similar goals, that everybody actually wants this place to work, whether it's because it's politically pragmatic, economically advantageous, spiritually desirable, neighborly, more comfortable. So when all of that begins to line up, then you can actually see how much social investment is taking place at all these different levels, from civil societal engagement to political party affiliations, and say, for example, in Malerkotla, the people from some of the Shiromani Akali Dal candidates are Muslim. You'd think they would be Sikh nationalists, but they are in fact, in this town, you have to have a Muslim from the town. So because then you can show that you're secular. And so that actually works for them, because now we have a cabinet minister instead of just a regular member of the Legislative Assembly. So everybody wins if we play that game. So I tend to not see one or the other as being the primary place that drives all this. It's not just the political pragmatism or the economic advantageousness, but rather where you see all of that integrating is where you're more likely to see a community that can suppress what they would see as the undesirable divisive voices, and where in Chikmagalur you see people clearly getting advantage out of division, or at least the dominant culture is getting advantage out of the division, is gaining more and more ground, gaining more and more rights over a site against all the court decisions and against any sort of legal grounds that they might have. They have that purchase in part because of a whole network of other systems that make that more viable for them. So, I mean, I'm in religious studies, so I'm more interested in the religious elements, but there are also legal systems and politics as well. But absolutely, thank you.
All right. With that, thank you very much for
this
provocative presentation, and especially how we think about the term secular different ways. And
you'll never think about it the same way again.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, and also for coming and.
I appreciate it.
Trip. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that we didn't have a snowstorm for you.
I know.
Good.
Not yet.